we're now going to begin. My name is Mike with the Department of Neighbor Empowerment, and I'll be serving as the production assistant for today's session. Please feel free to send a message in the chat if you have any questions or need support. We invite participants to be cordial and respectful to all the panelists and participants and to be open to differences of opinion. We invite all participants to adhere to the Neighbor Council Code of Conduct. Thank you so much again to the panelists. The panelists and hosts reserve the right to remove any participants for violating this code of conduct. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters. Thank you so much and welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this wonderful Saturday morning. My name is Louis Abramson. I want to thank the organizers for graciously inviting me to host this session on how the neighborhood councils can help affirmatively address what we all know is the crisis of our time, LA's homelessness crisis. So my name, as I said, is Louis Abramson. I'm on the Central Hollywood Neighborhood Council, where we're between La Brea and basically Gower, right on the border of West Hollywood. And we've got about 19,000 stakeholders, 660 of whom, by the 2020 count, are in fact homeless. So about 1 in 30 of my stakeholders is actually homeless. And to put that in perspective, only 1 in 10 own a home. So for CHNC, homeless folks are a serious stakeholdership, a serious constituency, and therefore we spend a lot of our time, a huge amount of our bandwidth focusing on this crisis, both in terms of addressing concerns of housed stakeholders, addressing concerns of unhoused stakeholders, trying to lower the temperature on conflicts, and trying to manage the immense amount of complexity involved in our city, county, state, governmental apparatuses involved in just trying to get one person from a tent on the street into a permanent unit somewhere. So I'm the chair of our homelessness committee, and in that capacity, I've met all the wonderful people on this panel who I'll let introduce themselves in just a second. But where I'm going to try to go with this today is to, the NCs are strange bodies. We're legislative in some sense, situated in the executive branch of LA government. And, we have various powers, sometimes not enough, we feel, and we have various sources of support, sometimes not enough, we feel. And so it can be hard to kind of understand, this crisis is so vast. How can a lowly NC really push back? In fact, where can we even get started? If I was interested in this as an NC leader somewhere, how would I even get started? So I'm going to try to address some of those questions today and to kind of encourage everybody on this call to recognize that they can help. They can contribute in meaningful, significant, and impactful ways. And I'm sure all of our panelists here today are going to flesh that out in terms of ways. So before we get started, just a couple of ground rules. NC members are very active community members, which means a lot of us are involved in gigs external to our official neighborhood council capacities. So today we have a diverse mix of panelists. Some are NC members and some are not NC members, but we involved in NC related work. I'm going to ask the NC members to speak principally from their standpoint as NC members. So this is a neighborhood council Congress, and those of us who are neighborhood council members are going to speak in that capacity. And we'll let our non-NC member panelists sort of address aspects of this that are outside the purview of the neighborhood council system. The way this is going to go is I've prepared 6 questions. One's a real easy one. And we're going to try to move through those in about 60 to 75 minutes, which will leave plenty of time at the end of this for open discussion, question and answer session involving any participants who have questions. And then the last thing before we start, I don't expect this to matter at all because everybody here is on the same page. But this is a panel dedicated to how neighborhood councils can affirmatively help end LA's homelessness crisis. So I'm here because I believe we can contribute to that mission, and I want to contribute to that mission. And I've invited others for the same reason. So I hope that's why all of our audience members are here. I'm sure it is. But I know emotions run high on this topic, and we all know that the situation is not good. So we're here to learn, understand, and identify ways we can help. And that's where I'm going to point this train today. So welcome aboard. With that out of the way, I'm going to let our diverse group of panelists, which are from across the city, east to almost the west side, I would say mid-city. But anyway, I don't know if Lindsay would agree. We've got NC members, nonprofit leaders, and volunteers. And I'm going to open the floor to them now. So we'll start with question 1. I'm going to go clockwise from top left in my view. So Jane Demian, why don't you tell us who you are, what your relationship is to the NC system, and when you decided to work on homelessness, either as an individual or an NC member?
Hi, Lois. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who's here today. I was very curious about why we were having a homelessness crisis in our city. I was born in Los Angeles and I've never seen it the way that it is now. I am now the homelessness liaison for the Eagle Rock Neighborhood Council. I'm also co-chair of the Housing and Homelessness Committee. I also do volunteer outreach to the folks in our community. And so what we did in 2018 is we started with doing a community outreach to stakeholders and asking them, what do you see as solutions to this problem? We had 2 of those large meetings, community discussions, and what came out of it were solutions such as we set aside a lot in Eagle Rock for homeless housing and homeless services. So that was a really huge deal. And now we have one tiny homes development that's going to be done in probably be finished at the end of December. Another one that Sasha will talk about probably in Highland Park, which is really close by. And so, yeah, I'm very, very much interested in making sure that these solutions work and to try to figure out how to navigate the bureaucracy that we all work in. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Helen Eigenberg, tell us who you are, your relationship to the NCs, and when you decided to get involved in this issue.
Hi, thank you, Louie, and thank you for everyone who's here and to the other panelists as well. My name is Helen Eigenberg, and I am the alternate for nonprofits on the Greater Wilshire Neighborhood Council. I also belong to a large community group that's called Hodge, which is Hang Out, Do Good. And that's where I think I have done most of my participation and volunteer. And I think one of the biggest things with Hodge has been about educating folks about our unhoused neighbors. I got involved in this at the start of the pandemic. I was friends with Carrie Morrison, who at the time was running Hollywood Forward before Brittany came in. And she invited myself and a couple others from Hodge to come join the weekly meetings at Hollywood Forward. And it was an incredible education into what's happening in the city, the bureaucracy of the city, why things work, why things don't work, the walls that you hit, and how to actually help. And then through that, I've come to know Louie, and it's just been a great experience. And so I think the biggest thing that I think I've contributed to the neighborhood which I live in, which is Hancock Park, is educating folks. Folks do want to help. They don't know how to help. They're scared. They're overwhelmed. They're disheartened. All those things that we all feel, right? And so I think it's hard to say rewarding because I do feel we are in the crisis of my lifetime, at least, with our unhoused neighbors. And it's been really beneficial to realize how we need to include everyone in this conversation. I also volunteer with SELA Hollywood Outreach on every other Sunday. And I also work over in North Hollywood at the NoHo Alliance on Wednesday, feeding folks. So yeah, I'm just here to help figure out how we help and bring everyone together on this and find a solution. Thanks, Louie.
Thanks, Helen. Lindsay Chase, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having this discussion. I think that the more discussions we have, the closer we can come to making sure that we can help all of our unhoused neighbors. But my name is Lindsay Chase. I sit on the board for Mid-City West Community Council. I have been on their Homelessness, Renters' Rights, and Refugees Committee since 2019. And I also co-chair their Social and Racial Equity Committee alongside my colleague Taylor Holland. Louie and I have done plenty of things together with regard to helping our unhoused neighbors, including we just did actually a couple of homeless counts this year without, as everyone or people might know, LASA didn't do a homeless count this year, a point in time count, but we thought it was very important to do one. So Mid-City West did one, Hollywood did one, and there were a few other bordering neighborhood councils that did participate in their own kind of rogue homeless counts, which was really helpful for us to drive our efforts forward. And then we also have been doing Homeless Connect days where we bring services to Mid-City West. So DMV and housing providers, nonprofits, mental health agencies. So we've done a few of those over the course of the last couple of years. We helped get Pan Pacific Park to remain open, their recreation center, as a winter housing shelter that's been open since the beginning of the pandemic. So that was extraordinarily helpful for our neighborhood. And we're also in communication with Nithya Raman's office because they are interested in opening an access center in our neck of the woods. So there is a lot of movement happening toward helping people with more services and access to services. But in our neighborhood, we call ourselves a resource desert because there are a lot of services available on the outskirts of Mid-City West, but there's not too many within our boundaries. So that's what we work toward, is trying to pull more access into our specific neck of Los Angeles.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah.
Jackie Vorhauer.
Hi,
Rock and
good
roll.
morning. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having us. I'm Jackie. I'm with the Center in Hollywood. I come from a television background. So I spent 15 years in TV, and homelessness has been something that's close to my family. I was just raised trying to understand homelessness, volunteering since I was 5. And finally, one day I was like, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot keep driving by and just chatting and just taking people to lunch, and then that's it. So I left TV and followed where my heart took me. And I ended up working at several nonprofits. And so for the last 6 years, I've been working in the side of homeless services and philanthropy and volunteer efforts. And I have to say that coming from a television background where we have budgets, we have deadlines, and a no means let's turn it into a yes. It's been very educating to go from just doing, the small things I was doing to actually being on this side and having to work through the many barriers that we are almost prescribing as a city and a county and a state and federally. We are prescribing barriers. And so I think being on this side and seeing our teams trying to work through that and really deliver the care that is not necessarily paid for, but that we know needs to be offered. And so that's been a great continuing education for myself. And it's been wonderful working with the neighborhood councils, like with the CHNC, Central Hollywood Neighborhood Council, and Hollywood Forward Coalition. Again, I think what you were saying, Lindsay, as soon as I know for our staff, as soon as we heard that the loss account wasn't happening, I talked to staff and our outreach team. I was like, well, we're going to do it, right? Like, we'll figure it out. And so it was great to hear that other neighborhood councils and other people were in the same mindset. So we came together and did it very effectively and did it very well. And I think, we've received some funding from neighborhood councils, which has been great, just to fill those little gaps that we just don't have the funds for to support the needs of our participants. So funding is important, but I think we're really going to be leaning heavier on the neighborhood councils in the near future for that education component that Helen was talking about. It's a constant education. We're never not going to be educating folks. And to also help amplify the expertise and the insights of our staff, because nonprofits are often maybe looked at like, oh, they're do-gooders, but actually our teams know what's effective, what's wasting taxpayer dollars, what's most efficient. And I think sometimes it's those external voices that are so much more powerful. And so I think that's where the neighborhood councils are going to be so much even more valuable to us in the future. So it's been great working with everybody, and I'm excited to work with even more folks in the future.
Thanks, Jackie. Feelings mutual. Okay, Sasha, take us home.
All right, great. Thanks, Louie, and thanks, everyone. So yeah, my name is Sasha Rappaport. I'm in Highland Park. I'm a board member and organizer with LA Forward. We predominantly focus on empowerment for civic engagement through education as well. So we know Hodge well, and so I'm here today in my through my role as the Housing, Renters, and Homelessness Ad Hoc Committee. I am the co-chair of that committee at the Historic Highland Park Neighborhood Council, and a lot of similar things to what Jane said. My role kind of got involved through connecting with other people in the neighborhood in northeast Los Angeles, where the majority of those people were really interested, concerned about their unhoused neighbors in their various neighborhoods across northeast LA. And from those conversations and starting from a standpoint of just trying to see what are the resources that are available in our neighborhoods, led me to being, I'd already known people in our neighborhood council, but I kind of checked in. There was open position for the homeless liaison, and there was no, it had kind of died in the beginning of COVID, the Housing, Renters, and Homeless Committee. So just kind of fortunate to be able to step in and resurrect both positions, both or the position and the committee, and then over the last year with the committee really focused on finding ways to support particularly our renters and then our unhoused community in Highland Park through supporting SEAL at Eagle Rock, now Highland Park chapter, through a neighborhood purpose grant, and trying to organize and make sure that people that are interested find the avenue to volunteer through that nonprofit that was doing direct outreach and providing some services to the unhoused. It also reached out to a myriad of other organizations, nonprofits that were doing work and that wanted to connect in before we made any choices through the neighborhood council to make sure that those people and those groups that were putting in the effort and making connections, that their voices were centered immediately. That was like the first thing, was connecting people together to see what was the best route for the neighborhood council to provide, in this case, funding to the organizations that are already on the streets helping people. And so that was my primary motivation getting started, was just making sure that we could connect people together and see what was the best avenue to provide support. From there, like almost everyone has mentioned, with partnership with Jane and Eagle Rock, we did a Eagle Rock Highland Park point in time homelessness count for those two neighborhoods. And then from there, and we'll talk more about this, tiny homes. So there's now a groundbreaking and soon to be open tiny homes in Highland Park. I think the council member would be sure that I mention it is the largest one, and it will be the largest one in existence. Sorry about the lag. I will see if I can fix that. And then I don't know if Louis did this on purpose, but I'm really glad to follow everyone, specifically Jane. If I can make one thing to kind of open or end my little spiel here, is that making connections to people that are doing this work is the most important thing we can do on the neighborhood council. I have learned pretty much everything and have mirrored almost everything that Jane has done in Eagle Rock, and that's where why we're, I think, more successful now than we were a year ago in supporting the unhoused in our neighborhood. And then the same thing, reaching out to Louis. Jane and I both connected with Louis to do the ad hoc or the point in time homeless count. So it's really important to find the groups, the people, the individuals, especially at different neighborhood councils, and connecting and collecting people together to learn and to take positive action.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So I hope our audience has gotten a good sense of who's on this call. And now we'll go into a sort of we're not going to go around the horn every other time. So the first question, though, what is the neighborhood council system's primary role, in your opinion, in addressing homelessness? I have some examples here, which I'll prime if we need it. But if you could just tell a story, or even just a blunt opinion about where you see the neighborhood council system is fitting in to this issue, and I'll open the floor. Whoever wants, free discussion.
I'll go.
Go ahead, Jane.
It's Jane again. Our neighborhood council did not have a homelessness committee, and so we formed one. And I think it's really important for all the neighborhood councils to form homelessness committees in whatever capacity that is, whether it's renters and homeless, or housing and homeless, or something having to do with that. I don't know what the requirements are citywide, but I would recommend that. I think that neighborhood councils could also do outreach. If you can create the committee, the homelessness committee, and then from your committee members determine who can do direct outreach to the folks, to your constituents who are unhoused. I think that's a very, very powerful tool, so that you get to know exactly what the needs are of the people living in your district. And then that would be communicated to the rest of the board, of course. And then that would inform the neighborhood council members and to be able to let the rest of the stakeholders know in the community what's really going on. Each unhoused person has a unique story. So it's really important to talk to those people and to get to know exactly what the problems are. Neighborhood councils have access to funding. The funding is very important, that we can draw that funding from whatever sources are available for the neighborhood council and be able to provide, you know, whatever it might be. In our case, we started doing outreach before COVID, and we actually were able to get some money from the neighborhood council. During COVID, we got emergency funding from the neighborhood council in order to provide food and water and various hygiene materials. So I think it's really important to tap into whatever those resources are to create a direct outreach committee or subcommittee and to be able to talk to your unhoused neighbors directly and find out what they need.
And I'm going to pull on this just a little bit. You said funding. As far as I know, $4 billion have been allocated to the county via our taxpayers and 1.2 to the city. Why is a neighborhood council's money important in this incredibly massive endeavor?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking you, yes. Or,
Okay.
or anybody. Why? Open to the floor. Why is neighborhood council money? You know, we usually get 32,000 bucks. We had 42,000 bucks last year because we had our 10K rollover. So 4 billion versus 42K. Why, anybody on this call, is my money important as a neighborhood council person to throw towards this effort?
Well, I'd like to answer that first before anybody else does,
Sure.
if you don't mind. I think the neighborhood council, the Housing and Homelessness Committee, we are able to identify how the money is spent, how it's focused on particular needs. If the money is spent throughout the city for certain types of services, it may not filter down exactly in the way that we intend it for our community and for the people who actually need it. So that would be my reason for asking, you know, for additional money that's focused.
If I can jump in from the service provider perspective, I think one, I'll do funding first, and then my hope for councils is funding wise, you know, the more programs that we take on that especially have government contracts, the more money that we have to shell out ourselves ahead of time. And we often don't get paid back for several months. And so we're fronting hundreds of thousands of dollars for items, for payroll, for all the necessities that participants need, for hotel stays, all these things. And so all that money that we're trying to fundraise for those small gaps has to go to those pieces first. So sometimes when we get neighborhood council money, it helps fill these gaps of these small but important essentials that are not covered by a government contract, you know, that don't fit into someone's ROI. Like for us, we're providing groups that really support people's mental health, physical health, and emotional health. So it's hot and we need carports to provide shade so that during the pandemic, we can actually do things outside and keep people safe. It was raining and we were actually able to bring people in so they could at least stand under a carport, get dry. We could warm them up, get them clothes. These are all things that really matter. It's a carport, but we are not going to pay, you know, that's not a priority when we have so many other things going on. So even like $2,000, $2,500 for essentials like that help us fill those little service area gaps that people don't see. And then secondly, my hope for neighborhood councils, what I hope their role is and will be is, honestly, I would love to see, you know, constant conversation with everyone, with volunteer groups, nonprofit providers, faith groups, regular check-ins, but also a big focus on homelessness prevention. And I think that's where I would love to see a deep dive with the community of who's in danger of falling into homelessness. Do we have a person who's elderly who's about to lose their home? Do we have a single parent who has 3 kids and they're on the verge? Because service providers, we've got enough work to do. Volunteers, we're doing enough work. But I feel like there's a gap of prevention. And I think that's where neighborhood councils could really tap in and fill that gap and find how to better support people so that we can start slowing down the funnel into homelessness.
Can I
Very
speak
good.
to that a
Yeah,
little
rock on.
tiny bit?
Yeah, yeah.
I think just building off of what the previous 2 commenters said, the partnerships are so important. And I think that's why on Mid-City West, for instance, we lumped in homelessness, renters' rights, and refugees. So we thought that those categories kind of fit nicely together. And I think to Jackie's point, you know, the renters' rights portion of our homelessness committee, we've spoken with plenty of people facing Ellis Act evictions and people who are losing their rent stabilized units, and how there's this gap in the city planning and building a new development where we're losing these really critical units by the tens of thousands every year, and they're not being replaced at that same rate. So I think that is a very crucial aspect of neighborhood councils, and how we can play a role in bridging those gaps in communication between developers and the city, and even the county at sometimes, and the tenant associations, and all of these other things, to kind of build those partnerships as we see the gaps continue to get bigger and bigger. And funding is super important. I also sit on the Midtown Homeless Coalition, and the neighborhood council and the coalition are constantly working together in partnership and providing each other resources so that we can perform the tasks that we're trying to accomplish in our community specifically. So I just wanted to kind of chime in and say how our neighborhood council specifically is trying to bridge those gaps in partnerships and with renters' rights and people that are at imminent risk of homelessness.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is it better? Okay, great. Yeah, so I think my answer kind of actually answers both the questions here. And I'm going to speak a little ideologically. I think, you know, I know that, you know, in practice, this is probably not always going to be the case, but I think ultimately the purpose of, or a large purpose of the neighborhood councils is to be able to give direct voice to the stakeholders. It is a means to be able to create you know, a more democratic system and give voice to everyone in that, you know, in each neighborhood. We live in Los Angeles in a kind of crazy system in which a city councilor represents, you know, more constituents than in any other city in this country. And so the neighborhood councils are needed to make sure that communities have voices and individual members, and the space for a homelessness, renters, you know, refugee, you know, people, I think at the margins, traditionally politically, this is an opportunity to give them a voice. And I think, again, ideally, direct voice. Like, we should have people that are unhoused being, you know, that are part of these committees that can actually voice, you know, their concerns in their own neighborhood. And that's the role of this committee in my mind. And then from that, why it's important to get funding is because in the system we have, the decisions that are made for most communities are not made by members of those communities. They're coming from a top, you know, hierarchical top down, where it's you know, a council member that is representing a whole lot of people that might not you know, be thinking about individual communities when the decisions are made. By having neighborhood councils being able to fund programs and provide funding for you know, different things that are important to stakeholders, and then go directly to those things that the stakeholders are requesting, and especially then unhoused, low-income communities of color, stakeholders, renters, refugees, all, again, people that are traditionally at the margins, that gives them opportunity to then get the things, services, whatever the case may be, directly, and at least more directly than they are able to, and have decision and agency over those things. And that, I think, you know, that's ultimately the role. It's ideological to some degree, but I think it's also where we need to start.
I'm going to jump in. We have 2 more minutes on this. So Helen, I think you said earlier that you've spent a lot of time. So far I had on my list here, funding, direct aid, facilitating, advocating, which have all been hit. And lastly, educating. So Helen, you mentioned educating earlier. Do you feel like that role is being filled by, I guess, your Greater Wilshire NC, or really more like Hodge? And would you, or yeah, I'm just curious, and you were the one who mentioned education, so.
Yeah, I would say Hodge.
Okay.
I know that Greater Wilshire Neighborhood Council has a homeless liaison who, from what I could tell, was mostly just coming in and giving updates on legislation that was being passed. There is no outreach being done to our unhoused neighbors in Greater Wilshire Neighborhood Council. There's some new young folks on the Neighborhood Council now who I'm hoping will jump in. So right now, I have found it to be more useful to do it all through Hodge. And I think we have this whole lunch program that has really educated folks that's been going on since the start of the pandemic. And it's been a great tool. And then also too, what's been great is by being involved with Hollywood Forward and, you know, being in touch with CELA or NoHo, all these other places that are actually, and the center, doing the work on the ground, we find ways to support the work that they're doing, which I think is a crucial part of it, because I'm certainly not an expert on this, and a lot of the folks that are in Hodge are not experts on this. So we follow the lead of the center, and we can support the work that they're doing, which I think is a great role for us to fill, because I think there's a need for that.
Hi, Alvina. My president has joined our panel. Good to see you. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Let's move on to the next question here. We mentioned, okay, right. So there's a lot of activities. What I heard was a lot of activities, and I think one of the things that was certainly hardest for me to get my head around is like, how do we start? I'm the head of the homelessness committee. I want to do street outreach, or I want to facilitate street outreach in my community. You know, then the practicalities come in. I need to get how do I get a hygiene kit? How do I find a place to send food to me? Where do I find storage? I think these practicalities become, you know, besides learning information, where are the homeless folks in my neighborhood? And where are the other partners I can link up with? You know, just the practicalities of starting an effort that you think is going to lead to positive change. So I'm interested in, how did your NC or your organization start doing the work you're doing? And how, more importantly, how did you make it sustainable? I'll open the floor.
We started out as a neighborhood council doing outreach based on the need. And the needs, as I mentioned earlier, was that we had community discussions and there were stakeholders, housed stakeholders, concerned about what was going on in the community. We had not yet done outreach to our unhoused neighbors. So following the last community discussion, our neighborhood council formed the committee. We decided to do outreach, and that's how we started. And that's how we learned what we needed to do. And the second part of your question was?
How do you start? How do you make it sustainable?
Oh, so after doing that for about a year, we did finally join with a nonprofit with CELA, Eagle Rock Highland Park, and we became a chapter of CELA. We were able to do our own fundraising. But during the time that we were with the neighborhood council, that was during the emergency, and we were able to get emergency funding because everything was closed. The churches were closed, the restaurants were closed, everything was closed. And I noticed that somebody said neighborhood councils are not social service agencies. But during a pandemic and an emergency, you know, we have to check on our stakeholders. We have to check on our seniors. We have to check on everybody who's low income, people have lost their jobs. We were in a really crucial time. So at that time, our neighborhood council did step up, and the city did step up and provide funding for those low income and very vulnerable communities.
I couldn't have said it better, but we also at Mid-City West were extremely fortunate that we had people sitting on the board that were extremely connected to service providers in the community. So we had Emily Cantrim at first, who was really involved at the local level, and she actually is, you know, and the chair of the Midtown Homeless Coalition. So there was already connections to what needed to be done, and the driving force behind it, and the partnerships and the networking was already there. And then we had Arnali Ray, who works for Saban Community Clinic. She took on the homelessness committee as chair, and really, again, the connection that the folks that we had sitting on the board had already existing throughout the community was extremely helpful in all of our efforts. So when I joined in and really started to get involved, I think to answer the second part of the question, it's about maintaining those relationships, even when you see a drop off of the people who had those relationships initially. So Anali is no longer the chair of the homelessness committee. We actually just appointed a new chair last week. She's less familiar with the system, but I'm still there to help nurture and keep contact with the folks that we have those networks built in already to just keep the conversations going, see where the needs are, figure out what's next with regard to how to do outreach and advocacy and education, and hosting forums with our community. We've done some engaging with your unhoused neighbors web series where we had, panelist discussion and had a bunch of people that are volunteers in our neighborhood come on to really learn how to engage. So I think it's about maintaining those connections that already exist and knowing who to reach out to and not being afraid to reach out to the people in the community that we know can be helpful with whatever questions we might have.
How about it's just sorry. Anyway, hi baby. So how about Helen, how did Hodge make its work sustainable?
It's just been through the generosity of all the people that are involved in Hodge is really what it comes down to. Yeah, I said before, people really do want to help and they're not sure how. So I think what we've done is this is what I will say. There is so much knowledge and expertise out there, like what Jackie was speaking to. The folks that work at the center, the folks that are, working even through CELA has learned so much. There's so much knowledge out there. So to tap into those folks who are on the ground doing the work is really helpful to those of us that, that don't, right? And to get that education. So I think, we're just really fortunate with Hodge that we have a lot of really kind, compassionate folks who are just willing to really give. And I think it feels different than just handing money off to somebody. We're giving them specific things like, I know CELA Hollywood, we needed tents and we needed, hygiene kits. And so I reached out to folks and said, here's a specific thing. And people love that because it feels it's personal to a certain degree, right? It's something physical that they can actually do. And a lot of folks aren't going to go into encampments. And that's okay, right? There's people that are comfortable doing that and there's folks that aren't. But this is a way for them to actually help very specifically, knowing that it's not the fix, but it's the band-aids that we have at this moment to just help people try to sustain until we've got, better, solutions here.
I'm going to use my privilege as the moderator to weigh in here, which is, I think what I'm hearing and what also applies to Central Hollywood is a lot of it is serendipity. So a lot of how these things start is, a person. And I think that one of the great things about being on an NC is the opportunity to get to know basically everybody. You're close to nonprofits, you're close to ordinary residents who can volunteer, you're close to the city council districts who can help connect you, you're close to the state, you're close to the county. So what we did was also basically, pull on that. We used our own storage closet. So if you've got a place where you meet regularly, you can put hygiene kits in there. And you just start from there. And I think the sustainability comes from, like, for us, it was important that all of us the volunteering is important so that no single person is like, mission critical. Like I should be replaceable. And I think that you just have to kind of keep doing it. And eventually you build up a group of well-trained people that can kind of jump in and fill any role. So for folks on this call wondering how to get started, talk to one of us. We'll help you out. If you need help trying to find a storage space, or you need help trying to figure out what you even want to provide, talk to your fellow NC members and we'll get you over that first piece of friction at the beginning of just the confusion of there's so much to do. And given that everybody here did a homeless count, we can also tell you how to map your population and see where the need is. Okay, next question. So This is a question for non-NC members. So Helen and Jackie specifically. How did you connect with the NC system? In other words, how did you first kind of learn about, so I didn't learn about the neighborhood council system until I ran for it. And then I was like, wow, there's this whole government I didn't know about. This is awesome. How did you connect with the NC system, and how has it, we've talked a little bit about how it's helped your work. And instead of what is your ultimate vision for the NC system, what's your ultimate vision for the organization's relationship to the NC in a Los Angeles that functioned well? So that's a complicated question, but first, how did you connect with the NC system? Jackie,
I'll
you want
jump
to
in.
start? Okay, Helen,
Sure.
to start. Okay.
You know, I too never knew about the neighborhood councils, probably until about 3 or 4 years ago, when at one of our Hodge meetings, which are just, you know, everyone comes, and we were doing a 101 with David from LA Forward. And he actually brought up, did you all know that there are neighborhood councils? We were like, wait, what? So I think that is part of it. And I mean, I can see it at how how the low attendance to the neighborhood council of the Greater Wilshire Neighborhood Council, people do not know what neighborhood councils are. Sorry, they just don't. So once finding that out was super helpful, and then trying to get an understanding of them. And then, I mean, I'll be honest, I have learned a lot from the Central Hollywood Neighborhood Council, because you all are so committed to working with our unhoused neighbors. And so I'm literally 5 houses away from the Central Hollywood Neighborhood Council. So I'm right on the cusp. And, you know, again, it's that education thing. People are desperately trying to understand what has happened in this city. And so it's like, I will go and hear, I mean, Louis, you all have been great at bringing in people to speak and talk about all this. And I take that information and I go back and I take it to Hodge, and, you know, we clarify things for people, right? You know, I mean, there's so much misinformation out there about our unhoused populations. And it's a way, I just feel like it's imperative that we really make the narrative honest and truthful, so that people can have a better understanding and then know what they can do about it. You know, I mean, you talked before about like advocating, like calling in on city council meetings, or calling into, you know, our assembly people to saying, you know, what about this bill? What are you doing about it? There is power in that. So that's what I have to say.
Jackie, what about you? How did you first learn about us? And then we'll go back for the rest.
So I will echo, I never knew that there were neighborhood councils. Like maybe when I lived on the East Coast, and when I moved out here, I was just on a newly formed homelessness concerns committee in Mar Vista. We were like, you know what, there's a problem. We're going to get together and start doing stuff about it. And then we're like, oh, there's a neighborhood council. Okay. And not to put down that neighborhood council. It's just, it's a lack of education. It's not part of our everyday, you know, vernacular. So as I got into that and then moved into homeless services, then I started meeting people, understanding people. I know the centers had a relationship with the neighborhood councils. So in my role, I kind of started falling into that. And I think, you know, one thing that I would love to do with neighborhood councils and partner on, and that I hope, you know, more neighborhood councils will do, is make time and space for more of these discussions and educational, really, I would say educate and engage, more of these educational sessions before they get so full scale that when we're post-pandemic, our, you know, big meetings are packed and you can just feel the tension in the room. You know, places like the center, we have outdoor space. We actually had a parents group from the school across the street over last week. They held their meeting there. We presented for 5 minutes. It ended up being like a wonderful half-hour discussion. And like, we're partners, you know? And so like places like the center, we have space. So if if neighborhood councils ever feel like, you know what, can we have a smaller meeting and let's invite a few people from the neighborhood who are really struggling with something, come on over and let's have those conversations. And so I think having those smaller, intimate conversations where people can really get their questions answered, we can bring people into the challenges we're having so that people are advocates with us. We all want the same thing ultimately. And so I think really, you know, with neighborhood councils, I wouldn't be afraid to like reach out, not CNHC, they're great. But, you know, others, don't be afraid to reach out to the nonprofits or service providers and say, hey, can we do a few small meetings together? Like, let's just do that. And let's answer these questions that are really getting people worked up. And also I'm seeing in the comments a lot of misinformation that's very easy to convey. And I think that's an opportunity where just for this, the neighborhood councils to keep pushing out facts so that people, understand that better.
Helen, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to just kind of piggyback on what Jackie was saying. Like, we had Nathan and Jackie come and speak at a Hodge. And I'll tell you one thing that really just reverberated through all of the people at Hodge. And that was when the extraordinary Nathan Sheets, who is the executive director of the center, came and spoke and said, I want to acknowledge the trauma that everyone is experiencing with our unhoused communities, right? Those of us, I mean, I find it overwhelming at times to drive on Vine Street or go down, when the Ivar Triangle, when there was unhoused folks there. It is traumatizing to the folks living on the street, as well as all of us that are living in this city. And so again, that was so helpful. And what it did is it brought up compassion from the group, right? And Nathan talked about and told stories of the folks that are coming to the center. And again, humanizing. And one other thing, and then I'll stop, but Louis has this other thing too with doing the CELA outreach in Hollywood. And Louis, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I think your mission is getting us as housed folks to meet the folks that are on the street, know their first name, right? Just making connection, because when you connect with that human being, which unhoused folks are, we're all together, right? We're all the same. But there's something that happens when you recognize, like, this is a human being. They have a story, and they have a story just like I have a story. So there is so much that we can do as the housed population to help in this crisis. Thank you.
I'll open it up. We're a little ahead of schedule, so this is good. So now to the NC members, what do you think? What is good about the relationships you have with nonprofits, and how would you like to, first of all, I don't know if you agree with Jackie's sense of the kind of relationship we ought to have. I do. But what about your relationship with nonprofits or with external NC actors do you think is working, and what would you guys like to improve?
This is Jane. I can answer first. When we first started, we actually did a lot of work with a local nonprofit, the Eagle Rock Association, and they were very much instrumental in helping us to organize the community discussions. They were very instrumental in funding shower events. So that was very, very important for us. After that, we did join with CELA, and we were able to get other services that way. But the neighborhood council also worked with the council office. And I saw there was a question about that. We work very closely with the council office. We work closely with other community groups in Eagle Rock, and certainly in Highland Park as well, to be able to talk to folks about what is really needed, what needs to be done. So I think it's a very valuable type of arrangement and relationship. And I'm really happy that both Jackie and Helen are talking about some of the work they do, because I would certainly like to get more involved with that. I might want to invite you guys to come to our neighborhood council meetings or our committee meetings. So all of those suggestions are really valuable. The people we work with are valuable in many ways, and I think we just need to do more of it. I would like to have better relations with our service providers. I don't really know them very well. So that's something that we really need to work on. And anyway, so that's it. Thank you.
Anyone else want to add?
Yeah, I just, one of I think the great opportunities we have in terms of like connecting with nonprofits is to give opportunity for the community to connect to them, especially just educational opportunities. So we've invited in a number of nonprofits to come and just talk about what are your rights during COVID as tenants. And a few other ones just to come in and speak to the community about, the issues that the committee, that's what their role is. And so that's been really, really great. And then to echo, really similar to what Jane just said, connecting into the nonprofits like CELA Eagle Rock Highland Park chapter and others, but also just, we've connected and spoken with the tenants union and to provide an opportunity to see how we can engage tenants more directly, things like that, just opportunity to make more direct connection to bring people into the committee in this case as well, to make sure people are aware, because that, I think everyone's already said it, it's like, it can be really challenging to make sure that, number one, people are aware, and also like it's hard to join. Not everyone has the ability to join a Zoom conference to begin with. And so, I think one of the questions I'd like to pose to this committee is like, how do we get back to direct engagement with the community? Like, do people have plans? Like, how are you looking to kind of open things up? Also, like, we're constrained by the fact that I think there are, rules by the neighborhood council, and, that says like when we can go back. But like, I think, how are you thinking about entering back into, the real world as it is? But the other thing I'd like to say is we have, we might talk about this a little bit more, but the council, pushed a motion that now we have a tiny homes village that is being constructed. The council office did provide a town hall as an opportunity for, questions to the community. It didn't, there were some issues where people didn't know about it. The physical letters arrived the day after the event. So I think it's a huge, it was really a huge issue because people didn't feel like they had agency or even ability to connect and talk about what their concerns are. And so like right away, we opened our committee to have number one, the city council office have representatives come, but more importantly, the nonprofit that is providing the services at the tiny homes. In this case, it's Hope of the Valley Rescue Mission, come to be able to answer questions, the council office answer questions. And we've had now 2 open forums through our committee, and it's literally gone from a very negative environment. The first time where people were I think, coming in very anxious and to some degree upset about the experience they had, not even necessarily about this tiny homes. We've now had a second meeting, and the narrative has shifted. I think giving people opportunity just to feel like they're engaged in their community about decisions that are being made has a real big impact. And then also, again, I think it was you, Jackie, that put it in the chat, but like, there are a ton of misconceptions by having people being able to just answer questions repeatedly. They're almost always the same questions. I think is also really important, because these are people that either have direct lived experience or experience, with these communities that we're supporting, that can, answer questions. And I think it's really important to provide opportunity. And then I think our role is to moderate, to not, to do our best to be able to, allow as many questions and do, it's a really challenging, I think, role to some degree, but like, it's really important that we take on moderation of community questions with nonprofits to ensure that like, people feel like they are able to have their questions answered and they are engaged with these nonprofits as well. And I think it does lead, I think, in a more positive direction, certainly over time.
So we're halfway through. I see a hand in the participants list. We're going to do question and answer at the end. I got 2 more questions. So if we can hold on to questions until we're done with the primer, so to speak. So if we could hold on to questions, we'll get to them at the end of the questions. You should have 30 minutes at least, probably, to talk about questions. Okay. And just remember, for those of everybody who came in a little bit after the intro I made, the purpose of this panel is getting a yes. The purpose of this panel is figuring out how we can affirmatively help as NC members. There's a lot of stuff that's wrong. We all know it. I just got emails this morning telling me about how much stuff is wrong on one street in my NC. I'm going to go talk to them later today. So we're trying to figure out what the NCs can do to help the effort that is so critical to our city and increasingly our country, to get everybody indoors. All right. So I just want everybody to focus on that page. I know we all are working towards the same end. So Sarah, if you could just hold your question to the end, we'll get there in a few minutes. Next question. How do you, your NCs, or your organizations help the public get behind the work still needs to be done? This goes to what Sasha was just saying. How do you handle conflicts? How do you distill the complexity of this crisis so that ordinary folks who don't spend as much time thinking about this as we do can grasp what they need to grasp?
I could start with that. I think content creation, and to your point about transparency, it is talking one-on-one, but it's also creating messages by video, photos, webinars, anything that just basically lives on the web that people can reference at their convenience, and showing folks bagging, phone banking, going out to the streets. I think our CD13 council member does a great job actually with videos. Mitch O'Farrell, he does show a lot of what he does. And there are other council members that maybe don't have like a video team or production emphasis that are doing great things behind the scenes, but the public may not know about it. And their social media isn't pinging them of, look what your council member is doing. So I think just a little more on the media, because they're not reading newsletters, they're watching videos, especially short ones. Just something like that. I think everyone from neighborhood councils to nonprofits to council members should take advantage of at this point.
I'm gonna jump. Oh, go ahead, Louis.
No, Jackie, no, go ahead. I was gonna read every question.
I was gonna say, I actually was gonna piggyback on that, because one thing that I know the center is doing is we're completely revamping our website and giving it the lens of how can this be helpful to someone who is experiencing homelessness or about to, and to our housed community members and businesses. And so the idea is, instead of people always having to ask for help and what can I do, and there's this person I want to care about, but I don't know what to do, we're trying to funnel all the resources onto one page, so that at 2 a.m, anyone can go there. And even if we're not the resource, that's okay. So I think that's the idea too, is we're trying to share resources that are outside of our scope, just so everybody feels like they have a place to land. They're empowered to say, oh, okay, so the center is not going to do that intake, but I can call that place. And here's a different situation. And okay, I can send the person to the center to get their mail, and then they'll help direct them this way. And so from the nonprofit side, we're trying to not be a one-stop shop for everything. We do what we're good at, but try to have a place where people can land anywhere from their phone and feel empowered with the information we can give them. I think also that piece too is, it's funny, Helen, I actually wrote down that quote about, I share it with everyone, is that it's traumatizing for everyone. And I'm glad that sat with you, because that's what we try to tell everybody is, I still feel like there's this us and them, mentality or feeling. And service providers, we're burning out, not me, but I am, but our frontline staff are burning out. They would love to see a reduction in homelessness. This is not, people's retirement fund. They're there because they care. And so we want the person off the street and in a healthy environment just as much as the person who's running a multi-million-dollar real estate agency, and so we're all in it together. The paths and the perspectives on how we get there are different. So I think for us, we are trying to do our best to bring people in smaller groups, have those one-on-one meetings, and to try to let people know, it's okay if you are angry. It is okay if you are upset. I'm not going to take it personally. I didn't do anything to make this happen 10, 20, 30 years ago. We're trying to address it now. And so I think if people understand that nonprofits are not just do-gooders, they're people who know and are in it and want other voices to amplify the things that we need to happen at a higher level to better impact the work that we're doing. And so, I think for us, we are trying to do more outreach, because it's intimidating for people to come up and say, I don't get what's going on. I don't think you're doing enough, this and that. A lot of people won't say that because they don't want to hurt feelings, but that's okay. The conversation is not always going to be comfortable in the beginning. And that's part of the learning and education and engagement process.
I think that education thing is so important. And Elvina, you mentioned, those videos, the average person in a neighborhood doesn't think the city and the county are doing anything, because when you look, it doesn't seem like it, right? And so again, it's educating folks that these things are happening. And so, by whoever's office is sending out these videos of saying, this is the kind of stuff going, we've educated our folks, they didn't know that the Hollywood Y there were showers. Oh, right, there's showers that someone can go to. So education is key. We also took a group of folks because in CD4, land is a real problem, right? We all know that. But tiny homes, we'd love to have tiny homes here. So what we did was we took a small group over to Hope of the Valley, and they did a tour. And so folks that live in CD4 were like, wow, this is kind of amazing, right? And then, and they get services while they're here. So again, it's just that really educating folks, because the education is just not out there. And that is when people aren't educated, that is what causes the fear, which then causes the anger. And I also think it's really important and that we get away from the name calling. We have to stop using the term NIMBY, because the minute you call someone a NIMBY, they shut down on you and now there's no chance. We're not going to bring everyone over in this conversation, but we will bring a lot of them by stopping the name calling. People, NIMBYs and all of the name thing, it comes out of people not being educated and being scared, which then culminates into horrible anger. So I'm becoming a big proponent to stop the name calling, because we've got to find ways to move forward.
I
Anybody-
want to just talk
Yeah.
about something that we recently did. One of our stakeholders came to our neighborhood council, to our committee, asking about the street engagement strategy and LAMC 4118. And up to that, and this is very new, up to that point, I don't think anybody did any education about it within our neighborhood council. So our committee put it on the agenda, and we had quite a few people coming to the meeting to talk about this. We asked the council office to come and also to explain from their point of view how it was going to work in our district and in our community. And a lot of folks just thought, well, what this means is we're going to get to move people off the streets, yay, but that's not what this says. So it's really important for us to talk to our community members and to let them know the street engagement strategy is a very different animal than the idea of kicking people off the street. The idea is to get people housed. And so if you can think about, we're going to move people off the street into housing, we're not going to move them off the street somewhere else. And that's really the difference, in a simple way of saying it. So I think that's a really good place to start, especially with the new law that just been passed, because there was a lot of confusion. A lot of people had no idea what it meant. And our neighborhood council and our committee members, we also have to familiarize ourselves with the law and exactly how it's going to impact our unhoused neighbors, because they're scared and they don't know what's going to happen to them. So we have to talk to them. We have to talk to the housed neighbors, and we have to get everybody to understand that this is about finding housing and services for the people on the streets. This is not about criminalizing or throwing people in jail or any of that stuff. And yeah, there may be some issues about substance abuse. There may be some treatment that might be needed. There might be mental health treatment that's needed. So all these things are really important. And we have to come together as a society to face those realities. And I think that's really important. Education is the key. And I agree with everybody who said that already on this call. Thank you.
And I'll share one anecdote. I think empowerment is our absolute hardest job as a neighborhood council. I think we're called the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, and it's absolutely the most difficult mission we face. I mean, 19,000 stakeholders in CHNC, 90% are renters. They're hard to talk to. They're busy. Median income is like $56,000 in my household. So, people are trying to stay in housing, and that means they don't have a lot of time to talk about folks who aren't in housing. They just, are concerned about the issue. So one thing that we found to be helpful is when people have a conflict, for example, with an encampment nearby, bring them in, have them propose some solutions. As a neighborhood council, we know all the constraints, right? We know about 4118, 51, 5611. We can talk to LAPD. They can tell us about what arrests look like, how people are processed by the jail system, how that was changed by COVID. And we can sit around a virtual table and say, look, I'm going to let you tell me what you want to have happen, and I'll let you know when you're running into a constraint, but otherwise I'm just going to sit here and facilitate the discussion. And I have found that typically brings the heat from like 11 down to like a 3. And what people typically end up with is a solution list that's like, provide them with an offer of housing, help them get sanitation so that it's not as messy, help them stay 3 feet compliant for ADA stuff, and then like a couple of other stuff. And we went through this exercise of having a group of stakeholders come up with this list, and we voted on it, and whether or not to endorse a letter to the city council that supported this thing. And we ended up doing it. And there were only a couple of line items that were, out of bounds. So I think getting people involved in the process, either by trying to suggest their own solutions, where, as I think Helen was saying, like ultimately we do share a lot of the same values, and when people have to process, like, I want to do XYZ, it helps bring the the emotions out of it. They have to engage their other hemisphere, right? And that is important. And then also doing the direct outreach if they can. I mean, we have had success in having people really turn around when they start meeting unhoused people, because they, you know, the first time that you do it, I just think you can't really have an accurate model of homelessness until you do actually start meeting homeless folks. And because they are, spoiler alert, people, and people are very, very diverse, and it's very difficult to have an accurate model of people in general. So until you start actually getting a sense of like the reasons why people are on the street, what people's lives are like, I think it's hard to move past the like initial trauma of living in a community where 1 in 30 of your neighbors, you know, has effectively been, you know, left to fend for themselves on the street.
Can I say something real quick, Louis?
Jackie, please. Yes.
Sorry, this is also the power of the neighborhood council, is we always try to think about our language too, because language changes the narrative sometimes subconsciously. And so I know for years, even if anyone's here on the mayor's office, like years ago, I'd work on press releases with the mayor's office. And like, instead of homeless people, can we say people experiencing the homelessness? Not to be too PC, but honestly, it's about the person first. We have to recognize it's a person in a certain circumstance. And so that's why there's been a shift of people really pushing to say houseless, unhoused, our neighbors experiencing homelessness, our neighbors on the street, because reinforcing that, especially if it comes from the neighborhood councils, I think it slowly starts, you know, being embedded in other people's vernacular. And I do feel strongly that when we think about the language that we're using and the neighborhood council, you know, it's coming from electeds, it really helps kind of hit a little reset. It's small, but I think it helps big picture.
I agree. Shall we move on to anybody else want to wrap this up, or we'll move on to the last question? The last question is a big question. Okay, we'll move on to the last question then. All right. We were talking about having honest and frank and edifying conversations with stakeholders, so I think we should do it amongst ourselves too. The last question is, do you feel that you or the neighborhood councils are taken seriously by the rest of the homelessness response system? Do you feel that the things that you do are useful to other agencies or other levels of government? And ultimately, what do we need to succeed in achieving what we feel internally? You don't have to say what it is. What we feel as our optimal utility in this struggle. So I will set down the null hypothesis I have, which is, I think our work on a person by person level is taken extremely seriously, at least in Central Hollywood. I am very close with not just the providers. I will limit my comments to higher levels of government, because the providers are great and we talk all the time. So I think at like an individual person-to-person connection, our work is taken quite seriously, but I often feel like we're feeding them input that they can't digest. And I will point back to the homelessness count that we did, which was a monumental effort on behalf of literally hundreds of people, from Eagle Rock to you guys go out to Beverly Hills. So, and it was just unclear to me whether or not that data was able to be processed in a meaningful way by the government. Like we thought it would be, because the count usually comes out every year. And I feel like we got a pat on the back. Now, I'm not blaming anybody for that. Again, we were fully supported. Like it wasn't like we didn't get, like, it wasn't like people didn't think this was a good thing. It was just like, my model as a scientist was always, the homeless count's really important. If we provide a homelessness count, people will recognize we can do important things as an NC. And I am not sure we achieved that goal. The count in of itself was phenomenal. I'm glad we did it. It's really important. History will look back on it as the only robust measurement of what COVID did to the homeless crisis. So like, I'm not denigrating that. I'm just saying, I think I had a model that this datum was more useful to the system than perhaps it is. And I struggle as a neighborhood council member to figure out what it is I can do that will be recognized by other governmental actors as useful, because we want to be useful. And if we're providing a bunch of stuff that isn't useful, we would like to stop providing that and start providing something else that can help people move folks from the streets indoors. So that was, I'm setting you up please disagree with me vehemently, agree with me vehemently, change direction. But that's why I proposed this question. And I want to make it clear again, I'm not blaming a council member for this, a mayor for this, a bureaucrat for this. I feel like this is one of those parts of the system where there's just different languages or different needs, and there's a failure to articulate them across borders, even when the people on those sides of the borders are quite close. Okay. I'll stop. Who wants to go?
I'll go quickly.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
I would have to agree, right? I think that people who know what the neighborhood councils are and are active participants and engaged on a regular basis understand that what we're doing is meaningful. So when Mid-City West has our Connect days where we serve, the last Connect day we had over 35 different providers help over 180 people that came in and out throughout the day. So it's impactful in that way, but a lot of people they don't know about it. It's not as visible, right? Or in their faces as as it should be or could be, I guess. Like, we're constantly posting on Nextdoor, and we have an Instagram account, and we have all of these things, Facebook, but our engagement is not as high as it could be for how large our district is, right? We go from La Brea all the way to Beverly Hills, and then Melrose all the way down past Wilshire. So it's this huge geographic chunk of the city where, how do you get all of those people to know what a neighborhood council is and to want to be involved without, I mean, I walk my dog around and then end up having conversations with people, and the neighborhood council always tends to get brought up, and then you have conversations to try, and it's like everyone trying to break down super complex issues into a short conversation where somebody is upset and you're trying to like get the conversation back to the middle. And do we feel supported by our city council districts? Sure, sometimes they get involved and they come to our meetings and give their updates, and they come to our events and do all of these things. But I feel the same way as you do about the homeless count, right? Like, we put in all of this work, and then it was like, great, thanks everyone, and what came of that, I'm not sure. Same thing for the Connect days, like, thanks for doing this, and then like, what happens after that? So I'm not sure how to get that to be better. We made a resource calendar for our neighbors who were housed and unhoused. Like, one looked very different for the housed version, like, this is how you help somebody who's unhoused, and the one that was for the unhoused is like, this is where you can access resources, and resource calendar. And we were handing them out, and we printed them all out on cards, and we were giving them out to people. We had everybody print them and hang them up all over the place, and only like a couple of people like would reach out and be like, where do I get this calendar? And so again, it's a constant struggle, but I think we have to just keep pushing.
Anybody else? We have about 8 more minutes in this, and then we'll go to questions.
I would just say, not necessarily from the neighborhood council perspective, but just in general, getting folks engaged is just hard, right? It's always the same volunteers who always show up to do everything. And I think it's just the nature of it. And I just always try to look at it as, every once in a while we add one more person in, and then there's one more person. And I think that's what we just have to keep doing. It's hard. People have lives, and they're busy, and they're overwhelmed. And for many folks, they're trying to just get by on a day-to-day basis. And so it is really hard, but I think we just have to keep the little engine that could, and just keep going.
All right, well,
Sorry.
go. No, please, Jackie, go. No.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think it's on everyone who's in attendance here. It's obviously on, from service provider to neighborhood council to volunteer groups to everybody. Now that we're in this, and anyone who's listening, it's now on our shoulders to, what Helen said, like, just keep getting one more and one more person. And I think it's that idea of I've learned it's so noisy.
Yeah.
Whether if you're homeless, it's noisy, on the street. If you're experiencing the trauma of walking past someone who's homeless, it's noisy. And I think it's pulling people out and trying to take the time and make it less noisy for people and break down what feels is the impossible, break down the overwhelming. And what I say is there are people who are like, well, how can I help? I'm like, well, financially, I need donations if you don't want to do that too. Yes, I know you want to volunteer because of the pandemic, we're scaling back. And then I say 3, something you can always do is be an advocate. So I always try to think, I'm like, what Helen said, like people are busy, they have lives. What can I give permission to someone to do? You don't have to volunteer every week. It's okay if you can't volunteer. If you can do one thing this year, pick one time, one thing this year. Maybe it's calling into city council on this one measure. And if you can do that, that's great. So I think it's giving people the permission to know that there are organizations and people doing things. Support us, support them however you can. And if you can just do one thing, just do one. And that's okay. And I think it's validating people in knowing that, like, you don't have to be in it 100%. You don't have to be in it at 100, the whole time. That's why there are groups. And so you do what you can. And that's our mantra now too. For our staff who's in it full time, at some point we have to tell them because they're exhausted, they're tired. We're like, you have to do what you can. And we just keep doing that. So it's, we're in a crisis, and we just need to remember that, because if we burn ourselves out, we won't be able to keep moving on this.
All right. So thank you very much, everybody. I think unless anybody has any remarks they want to make about any of the questions I've asked, I am happy to open it up now for our participants. We've got about, I think Mike can correct me if I'm wrong, there's going to be about 20 minutes left for Q&A. This can be as freewheeling as anybody wants. And I'm going to call on folks as I saw their hands. So what we'll do is, I would prefer people to raise their hand and enter it in the chat box, only because it gets hard to track. So if you had a question in the chat box that you want to have answered, go ahead and raise your hand now. You can use, if you're on the phone, I believe it's *9. We'll raise your hand, but I will call on folks as I saw their hand. So first up is Sarah Ramswack. If you wanna, I'm not sure I can unmute you, but if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very, very much. And Louis, I certainly thank and respect your putting me on hold. That's a-okay.
Okay.
Don't want to ask a question, but I want to make a couple of comments. First of all, I love Elvina's new little neighborhood council learning how to do all those things. The baby is beautiful. Going on, I was listening very interestingly with everything that was said, and I was glad to hear it. I was for 9 years a member of the North Hollywood Northeast Neighborhood Council, and I am today a community advocate, as somebody suggested up there somewhere. Anyway, I would like to address your homeless issue and say, I know a person and I know her name. And I think it was Susan that was saying, knowing the names of somebody, or maybe I'm wrong on who said it, but I know her name and I have eaten a meal with her. Mm-hmm. Her name is Susan Colvin. She was homeless. She managed to get involved in a food for homeless church in Sunland Tahunga area, and eventually was offered a job. She is now independent, and she has established her own nonprofit that is already working in the Sunland Tahunga area. And it is a remarkable story. So if you're looking for any inspiration to move forward, I would be glad to give you contact information for Patty, and she will tell you her story and how she survived to become independent and to reach out. And I loved when Susan was talking about the tiny homes. I know that in my CD district with Paul Krikorian, our council member, he has already established 3 different locations in our CD2 for the tiny homes, and they are remarkable. They are remarkable. And when I went to the last one that was just opened, the statistic was that when the person is eligible to participate in the tiny homes and then to move on to the next step toward independence, they have about an 85% success rate, and that is good.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about, is what you're doing helpful? Is it meaningful? I think that is a very meaningful health rate. Also, I was very interested in when, let me see, you're talking about being acceptable. Yes. And before I joined the neighborhood council in 2007, I had already organized a neighborhood watch in my own community in that neighborhood council area. And I think it was Jackie that was talking about how difficult it is to get somebody involved. So you see, in 2007, that is pre-COVID days. So I had no hesitation about going up and knocking on anybody's door.
Mm-hmm.
And believe me, I got invited in so many homes that I now learned to like Armenian coffee. Because I got coffee every time I was invited into a home. But in the time that I worked with the neighborhood council, we had over 300. Now, what is the secret, Jackie? It is that personal contact. That's harder now that we have COVID.
Mm-hmm.
That makes our abilities a little restricted. But you are right, it is difficult to get the attention of the renter, particularly. But every once in a while, you find somebody in the neighborhood that is a professional, such as I have a psychiatrist, I have a doctor, I have a lawyer, I have a pastor. In my neighborhood watch, and that's just a part of the neighborhood council. So when you find those professional people, give them a little extra push because they will generally join. I want to thank you very much for this workshop. I'll sign off now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it. Let's move on to Devon. Devon, go ahead.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, so it's Devon Williams here. I work closely with Lou. He's a part of the North Hollywood Neighborhood Council. But I always enjoy hearing him speak because I've been knowing him from the longest. I started attending the council meetings long before COVID and when we were meeting in person. But just thank you all the panelists. I'm gonna start driving right now, but just thank all the panelists. I learned a lot of information about the Hodge group that Ms. Helen mentioned earlier. I did not know of that. And also there's nonprofit groups that are boots on the ground in Skid Row as we speak. Usually every Saturday, there's this lady named Maxine who's at Skid Row just feeding the homelessness. So all I want to say is don't recreate the real, but just like join these organizations that are already out there doing all the work that just need the support, you know? And that's pretty much the message I want to get across. I'll be here listening, and thank you all.
Thanks, Devon. We look forward to seeing you back when we get our physical location open again. Okay, Robert Rouge, go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon, whatever it is.
It's indeed the morning, but go ahead.
Hi, I wrote in the chat earlier, I think the real issue here is how do we have compassion and law and order simultaneously? And the reason that I asked that question is, we are seeing, especially here in the Northeast San Fernando Valley, as well as Hollywood area, a tremendous amount of crime being committed that are being identified and linked to some homeless people. Now, that may not sound too compassionate from my end. I do believe we need services for them, housing and whatever else is needed. But it seems like we're losing here a very important element, that if we don't have the punishment for those who commit these crimes, what you're basically telling all of us victims out here that are of crimes that are being committed by identified homeless people, that we don't care about your part. We just want to give them social services so that our NGOs and other organizations who do tremendous work are more important.
Does anybody want to respond to Robert's question or comment here?
I'd like to answer, well, and I'll make a comment in response. Robert, we deal with those kinds of questions in Eagle Rock all the time. And no one that I know is saying that criminals should go unpunished. That was really not the focus of our work. If somebody is committing a crime, whatever it might be, the LAPD is involved, and they have their own processes for dealing with that. We're talking about people who are living on the street and due to no fault of their own or whatever reason are unhoused. So I would like to create a little bit of a difference between somebody who's committing a crime versus somebody who's living on the street. And that, I think, is an important distinction to make. If you're saying that the act of living on the street is a crime, that's different, and that's a whole different conversation. So I think it would be really good to define terms a little bit more, to say somebody who's committing a crime, whatever that crime is, if it's an assault and battery, if it's robbery, if it's, whatever it might be, we'd like to be more specific. And if there's somebody doing that kind of thing, then the LAPD needs to get involved. And if there are actual victims, then the victims would be coming forward to report those crimes. So I just want to make that distinction.
Go ahead, Jackie.
If I can add, Jane hit it right on the head. And also to keep in mind that a lot of the victims of crime are people who are on the street. It's been really heartbreaking. On Fridays, we have Women's Day. So anyone who identifies as a woman can come in. It's a safe space. And it's really hard at that 10:30 a.m. time when we're supposed to wrap. And you can feel the nervousness and the fear in those women as they approach the gate to exit. They don't want to leave, because we'll go around and say, how was your week? What did you do? And when I hear that like 3 or 4 people were assaulted, they're homeless and they were assaulted. So where was the protection for them? And so if there are crimes being committed to other people who are housed, imagine what's happening to the people who are unhoused. So I think, as Jane said, I think no one's saying, oh no, you can't touch someone, because they're this or that. If there's a crime, that's where, LAPD needs to come in and filter out, because it is also, for us, it's important for the protection of people who are so extremely vulnerable, who have a thin piece of nylon between them and someone else at 2 a.m, and they don't have a house to be in. So I think we all have a vested interest in trying to make sure that whether you're housed or unhoused, there is safety for everybody. So I think that's a priority for everybody. And I do, as Jane said, we need to make sure to think about our language of, there's a lot of people who are housed who are committing crimes. So homelessness is not a crime. What are the acts that are happening? And where is that intervention from LAPD?
Yeah, I'll also add, I think this goes back into what, I want really to push. Nobody thinks what's happening is good. There aren't people who think that right now the homelessness situation is peachy keen and everybody should just be able to live on the street unfettered by the laws of society forever. That's not on the table. What's on the table is a gigantic catastrophe, which represents the failure of effectively 100% of our social safety nets, or their non-existence. And part of that social safety net is also, effective law enforcement for everybody involved, right? The system is not working, and the purpose of this conversation is to figure out, given the NC's placement in the system, how can we leverage whatever assets we have to make it work better? One thing is, well, Robert, I see your question about current laws and prosecutors have hogtied law enforcement. There was another panel, I believe, about law enforcement's role in homelessness, and perhaps that was a question better directed towards that panel. But of course, obviously, the DA is elected. You're free to vote differently next time. And same thing with city attorney. So, but the point is that, nobody here is saying that because someone lives on the street, they get a pass for committing crimes. They don't. And the victims of those crimes are housed sometimes and unhoused also sometimes. And I think this is another really good reason to engage, because when I go to encampments, like a lot of the times they're like, man, we were, these other folks living on the street, there was also a crime here. We can't report it. There was no witnesses. So like, it's a problem everywhere. And I think there's no, I don't know how productive it is to think that like there's folks who like the status quo. And I'm not suggesting that you did, but it's bad. It's bad. And I think we should acknowledge that. And I think that we should acknowledge, like Nathan did, that all of us are in a situation where there's some level of harm, housed or not. And so, I think we all have a right to feel aggrieved in that sense. Yeah, go ahead, Lindsay.
We've also been trying to think of ways of how to break down the silos of our different committees on the neighborhood council. So, for instance, a lot of our committees in the past have operated very just independently of one another without really having communication between committees. And something that we've been really focused on at Mid-City West is making sure that there's representation from each of the interest points at other committee meetings. So for instance, somebody on public safety joining in on a homelessness committee meeting and vice versa. And, city planning or the pluck committee coming in and sitting with homelessness and renters' rights, and all of these different kind of breaking down the silos so that the communication and the stakeholders can kind of have these conversations in multiple different settings. Because, like us at Mid-City West, I mean, we're looking for stakeholders right now. Our homelessness renters' rights committee is it's low. It's only 3 of us right now. So we're looking for stakeholders. We're looking for more engagement. We want people to become engaged, and we can have these conversations about all of the different concerns. And then I will then turn around and go sit with Tao, who's the chair of public safety, and say, how can we kind of bridge these gaps? So I think, I think we just all have to still just keep working toward breaking down these silos of communication and making sure that the correct people are being reached out to with regard to different situations and happenings in the community.
Helen, go ahead. But before you do, Mike, can we get a time check real quick? I think we have either 5 or 10 minutes left. I'm not sure. Okay, go ahead, Helen.
No, I just wanted to throw out, because I'm seeing comments in the chat about, folks that are unhoused, not wanting, services because they don't want to follow rules. And again, we need to not think of them as a monolith. They are individuals. I have neighbors who are housed who don't want to follow the rules, right? And everybody also, it's not, housing for each individual is different, right? One person needs is very different than somebody else. So I just throw out to everyone to consider not thinking of our unhoused neighbors as this monolith and they all need this one thing. They are individuals just like us, and some struggle with rules, and like a lot of us struggle with rules. And so just keeping that in mind, that these are individuals with individual needs, and we're doing our best to meet those needs, and it's hard.
Okay, so I will then take my privilege and just ask in 30 seconds, is there anything that anybody wanted to discuss that we didn't get to today? Is there any question I should have asked that you were hoping I would ask and are furious that I did not ask? If so, answer it now.
Louis, I'm not furious about anything. I think
Good.
This has been great, but I do want to, I'm looking at the chat and there's all these questions in the chat. And I'm just wondering if some of those folks would raise their hand and ask the question, at least we could have the conversation here. So to Helen's point, I think it's important to point out that folks who are unhoused are not a monolith. And there are many different reasons. For example, if they don't want to go into bridge housing where a couple is separated, they may want to be housed together. So they might refuse that particular housing because the housing segregates them. That is not refusal of housing. It's not refusal of a program. So like Helen said, there are many different reasons why people say they don't want to go into housing or they might want something different.
Devon, I'm going to give you the last word before we sign off.
Yeah, so I'm like in the comments, but I just parked. But basically, I just want somebody, the person, I don't know who the Citizen 6 person is, but basically just to do your research. Because if you, I'm only 24, but even I did my research to find out about certain things that occurred, like how Skid Row was formed and the homeless population. But if you go back to the Olympics, they tried to do the same methods that you're inquiring about, being rough and, you know, forcing people off. But if you like, for example, when the Olympics came to Los Angeles, they forced all the folks that were at Skid Row on the street towards Orange County. But as you can see, as time proceeded, it got pretty worse than how it was back then. Now, if you look around, there's folks all around the Valley and Santa Monica, Venice Beach, Skid Row. So it stretches all around. So if you take that approach again, and then you have folks from outside of the country, when they glamorize Los Angeles, they don't really talk about certain things that go on here when you actually live here, you know? But it's just history, man. Just like do your research. I mean, I'm not mad or anything. I'm just saying, you know? And that's pretty much it. Again, thank you all, and I'm going back to silent.
Thanks, Devon. All right. Okay. So I think we achieved my objectives here. I hope we achieve the objectives of some of our participants, who I hope will all go back to their neighborhood councils and take some element of what we discussed today and use it to make some affirmative progress here on this issue. I mean, Central Hollywood Neighborhood Council, as I said before, we're in a little bit of a different situation than some folks. Like, we have 3 times the homelessness rate of the city at large. Other neighborhood councils, you might have a lot less, and that might be a really good place to start making these connections, because it's not so overwhelming. And so if you need help in terms of figuring out how to take that first step, we're all here. I'm sure our contact information is easy to obtain, or at least certainly those of us who are NC members, and we can link you to everything else you need. And please do reach out, because I think all of us here spend a bunch of our time on this, and if some of it can go towards spreading whatever we found that works, we would love to have that happen. So anybody else want to make any parting words? Otherwise, I will thank Jane Demian from Eagle Rock Neighborhood Council, Helen Eigenberg from Hangout Do Good in the Greater Wilshire neighbor area, Sasha Rappaport from Historic Highland Park, Jackie Vorhauer from the Center in Hollywood, Lindsay Chase from Mid-City West, and my president, Elvina Beck, and especially her little baby Atlas, for privileging us with their company today. All right, thanks, folks. Enjoy the rest of the Congress. Have a good day. Get outside. It's nice, and talk soon.